The Kremlin's apparently false claim that its forces killed 600 Ukrainian troops in a retaliation strike is generating new discontent among Russian military bloggers critical of military leadership since the invasion last February, a Washington-based think tank says. The Russian Defense Ministry said the strike Saturday targeted a temporary Ukrainian deployment point at a school in the Donbas region city of Kramatorsk in retaliation for a Ukrainian military strike on New Year's Eve. The Kremlin says the Ukrainian attack killed 89 Russian troops. Ukraine said its strike killed up to 400 Russians. Russian forces are intensifying measures to identify partisans in occupied territories, the institute reported. Russian occupation authorities blamed Ukrainian partisans for mining a gas pipeline in Luhansk on Sunday. 2 people were killed and a 13-year-old girl was among at least 5 people wounded by a Russian rocket strike on a market in the northeastern Kharkiv region, Governor Ola Syniehubov said. More people could be trapped under the rubble, he said. More than 24 Ukrainian junior athletes living in areas of war-battered eastern Ukraine are training in Cyprus for a month under an Olympic Dreams project. KYIV denies Russian claim that a retaliation missile strike killed 600 Ukraine soldiers. Iran's sale of lethal drones to Russia means the country may be contributing to widespread war crimes in Ukraine, a White House spokesman said Monday. The US and EU are looking to further ostracize both nations while struggling to stop the transfer of weapons desperately needed by the Kremlin. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said reports from Westerners who visited Kramatorsk after the retaliatory strike has not shaken the faith of leaders in Moscow on the veracity of the defense ministry claims. The Kremlin claimed a retaliatory strike in October that was clearly not a fabrication. After Ukraine struck a bridge linking the Russian-occupied Crimean Peninsula with Russia, the Kremlin began a massive barrage against Ukraine's energy facilities billed as retaliation for the bridge attack. Russian air forces have almost certainly used Su-57 Felon to conduct missions against Ukraine, yet these missions have likely been limited to flying over Russian territory and launching long-range air-to-surface or air-to-air missiles into Ukraine. According to UK intelligence, recent commercially available imagery shows 5 Felon parked at Aktubinsk Air Base, which hosts the 929th Flight Test Center. Russia has significantly reduced the use of combat aircraft along the front line after the armed forces of Ukraine began shooting down enemy planes and helicopters. Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Ukrainian military has already destroyed 285 planes and 275 helicopters, with 3 of them being shot down in the past day. On December 19, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that Russia had received a new batch of at least 250 Shahid combat drones from Iran. On January 6, the United States imposed sanctions against 6 senior managers of Iranian company Quds Aviation Industries, which is considered Iran's largest developer and manufacturer of drones. Former NATO official James Stavridis said that Russia's forces in Ukraine will be burned through and exhausted by the end of winter, creating an opportunity for peace negotiations. Ukrainian and Russian forces are fighting along an approximately 600-mile front, with Ukraine forcing Russia into defensive positions in the south and northeast, while Russian forces are seeking to advance around the eastern city of Bakhmut. Russian forces have suffered steep casualties in the war so far, and the Kremlin has mobilized around 300,000 people meant to give Russia an advantage in the months to come. In a recent missile strike, Ukraine killed hundreds of Russian recruits in the Donetsk region in a strike blamed on a basic error, raw soldiers giving their locations away by using their phones. Ukrainian intelligence has claimed that Russia is preparing to draft 500,000 more civilians for a potential spring offensive, a claim denied by the Kremlin. Stavridis told WABC that he believes Ukraine is winning the ground war because it is more motivated and has been given cutting-edge equipment by Western nations, like the HIMARS artillery used to blow up the soldiers in Donetsk. Russia retains an advantage in the air, Stavridis said, pointing to its use of drones to target infrastructure. Though both the Kremlin and Ukraine's government have in recent weeks signaled a willingness to negotiate, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said in December he does not believe there will be serious peace talks in the immediate future. The General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces reported on January 9 that Russia had lost 111,760 troops in Ukraine since the beginning of its full-scale invasion on February 24. According to the report, Russia has also lost 3,080 tanks, 6,147 armored fighting vehicles, 4,809 vehicles and fuel tanks, 2,069 artillery systems, 434 multiple launch rocket systems, 217 air defense systems, 285 airplanes, 275 helicopters, 1,856 drones, and 16 boats. Officials at a vocational school in an eastern Ukraine city dismissed claims by Russia that hundreds of Ukrainian troops were killed in a missile strike there, saying Monday that a rocket merely blew out windows and damaged classrooms. Russia specifically named the vocational school in Kramatorsk as the target of an attack in the almost 11-month war. The Russian Defense Ministry said its missiles hit two temporary bases housing 1,300 Ukrainian troops in the city, killing 600 of them, late Saturday. Associated Press reporters visiting the scene in sunny weather Monday saw a four-story concrete building with most of its windows blown out. Inside, locals were cleaning up debris, sweeping up broken glass and hurling broken furniture out into a missile crater below. Ukrainian officials on Sunday quickly denied the Russian claims it had lost a large number of soldiers in the attack. Despite the absence of any evidence, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said reports from the scene didn't shake senior officials' faith in defense authorities. A Russian Defense Ministry spokesman said the strikes on Kramatorsk were in retaliation for Ukraine's attack in Makiivka on New Year's Eve, in which at least 89 Russian soldiers gathered at a temporary barracks died, according to Moscow. Ukrainian authorities said hundreds were killed. It was one of the deadliest attacks on the Kremlin's forces since the war began more than 10 months ago and an embarrassing loss. Ukraine's deputy defense minister said Monday that Russian forces have launched a fresh assault on the town of Soledar in the eastern Donetsk region. Taking Soledar would allow Russia to intensify its attacks on the strategically key city of Bakhmut, where intense fighting has destroyed an estimated 60% of buildings. Ukraine's presidential office reported Monday that at least 3 civilians were killed and 12 others wounded over the previous 24 hours as 9 Ukrainian regions in the southeast of the country were shelled. Nikolai Patrushev, the secretary of Russia's Security Council, repeated that argument in an interview published Monday, saying that the events in Ukraine aren't a clash between Moscow and Kyiv, it's a military confrontation between NATO, and particularly the US and Britain, with Russia. Bagshaw, a resident of New Zealand, was in Ukraine to assist in delivering humanitarian aid, according to New Zealand media reports. Russia has stepped up a powerful assault on Soledar in eastern Ukraine, officials in Kyiv say, forcing Ukrainian troops to repel waves of attacks led by the Wagner contract militia around the salt mining town and nearby fronts. Soledar, in the industrial Donbass region, lies a few miles from Bakhmut, where troops from both sides have been taking heavy losses in some of the most intense trench warfare since Russia invaded Ukraine nearly 11 months ago. Ukrainian forces repelled an earlier attempt to take the town, but a large number of Wagner Group units quickly returned, deploying new tactics and more soldiers under heavy artillery cover. Russia's defense ministry did not mention either Soledar or Bakhmut in a regular media briefing on Monday, a day after facing criticism for an apparently false claim of a missile strike on a temporary Ukrainian barracks. Ukrainian authorities reported multiple Russian strikes across the country, including on Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, and infrastructure in the regions of Donetsk, Kherson and Mykolaiv, where the regional governor said 15 people were injured in the shelling of a coastal town. Russia, which initially cited a need to rid Ukraine of nationalists, now says it is fighting a Western threat to its own existence. Kyiv and its Western allies, which have imposed broad sanctions on Moscow and sent Ukraine weapons to defend itself, say last February's invasion was entirely unprovoked. Ukraine is strengthening its forces in the eastern Donbass region and repelling constant attacks on Bakhmut and other towns there by Russian mercenary group Wagner, Ukrainian authorities said on Monday. Ukrainian forces are repelling constant attacks on the town of Bakhmut in the eastern Donbass region and holding their positions in nearby Soledar in very difficult conditions, President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Sunday. A Russian missile attack on the Ukrainian city of Kramatorsk missed its targets and there were no obvious signs of casualties, a Reuters reporter said on Sunday. Moscow had claimed the strike killed 600 Ukrainian soldiers in retaliation for a Ukrainian strike that killed scores of Russians on New Year's Eve. Russia and Ukraine each returned 50 captured soldiers in the latest prisoner swap in the war. Ukraine said the returnees included fighters from Mariupol and Chernobyl. Freed Ukrainians sang the national anthem on their release. Russia and Belarus will hold joint aviation drills of the air divisions that are part of the two countries' regional grouping of troops. The drills will last from January 16 to February 1. Justice ministers from around the world will gather in London in March to boost international support for the International Criminal Court in its investigations of alleged war crimes in Ukraine, the British government said. Serhiy Cherevatiy, Ukraine's Eastern Military Command spokesman, reported that the city of Soledar, Donetsk Oblast, which has long been a target of Russia's Bakhmut offensive, is practically destroyed. According to Cherevatiy, Russian troops had recently attempted to find a weakness in Ukraine's defenses. In particular, Cherevatiy said Russia had concentrated its most combat-ready units, including the Kremlin-controlled Wagner Group militants, in the area. After an unsuccessful attempt to capture Soledar, Russian troops changed tactics and commenced another major assault, Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar reported. According to Maliar, Russian troops have also recovered losses by deploying a large number of assault groups formed from Wagner Group's best reserves. Along with the Russian military, the group has taken part in the fierce battle for the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut, around 215 kilometers southeast of Kharkiv. President Volodymyr Zelensky said in a video address on January 8 that Bakhmut and Soledar hold on in spite of everything, and called this area one of the bloodiest sites along the front line. Top U.S. officials are increasingly tracking the movements and efforts of a Russian private military group outside of Ukraine as Moscow continues to use the organization to launch influence operations in Africa and Europe. Prigozhin and Wagner have been under U.S. sanctions for years. But the U.S. has recently taken additional steps to try to control Wagner's access to weapons. At the end of December, the Biden administration implemented additional export controls on Wagner, making it more difficult to access any equipment with U.S. technology. The administration is also tracking Wagner's movements in Serbia and Belarus, a Russian ally that has staged Moscow's troops to prop up the war effort in Ukraine. Reports of Wagner Group operatives in Belarus surfaced in 2020. The government in Minsk announced that it had arrested 33 operatives working to sow chaos in the lead-up to the presidential elections. Wagner has positioned people in Belgrade as well, and announced it had officially set up operations in Serbia at the beginning of December. Since then, it has launched influence operations to counter activity against the Putin regime by elements of the Russian diaspora, one of the cables said. Meanwhile, Russia, aided by Wagner, continues to lose people on the battlefield in Ukraine, particularly in Bakhmut. The Institute for the Study of War, a think tank, assessed last week that Wagner's forces are serving in a chiefly attritional role in the city and have likely become degraded to a near debilitating extent. American officials are planning additional actions against Wagner to limit its role in Ukraine. The U.S. has already sanctioned Prigozhin, Wagner and its network, but additional financial measures are likely forthcoming. Britain is reportedly considering supplying Ukraine with tanks for the first time to help the country fight Russian forces. Sky cited one unnamed source saying Britain could offer around 10 Challenger 2 tanks. Britain's Ministry of Defense did not comment specifically on possible supplies of tanks to Ukraine, but pointed to its supply of over 200 armored vehicles and other equipment including air defense missiles and anti-tank weapons to date. Meanwhile, Ukraine is repelling constant attacks on Bakhmut and other towns there by Russian mercenary group Wagner in the bloodiest battle of the war so far in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine said it was strengthening its forces around Bakhmut in the eastern Donbass region and repelling constant attacks there by Russian mercenary group Wagner, whose leader has vowed to capture the area's vast underground mines. Kyiv had sent reinforcements to Soledar, a small town near Bakhmut where the situation was particularly difficult, Ukrainian officials said. Britain has committed to match or exceed last year's £2.3 billion, $2.8 billion, in military aid for Ukraine. Russia has occupied the Zaporizhia nuclear power station in southeastern Ukraine since last March, and President Vladimir Putin issued a decree last October transferring control of the plant from Ukrainian nuclear energy company Energodom to a subsidiary of Rosatom. The Russian Defense Ministry said its missiles hit two temporary bases housing 1,300 Ukrainian troops in the city, killing 600 of them, late on Saturday. Russia launched 7 missile strikes, 31 airstrikes and 73 attacks from Salvo rocket launchers in the past day, the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces said in a daily report. The British Defense Ministry says Russia is almost certainly using its most advanced combat jet in operations against Ukraine while limiting the risks involved. Volodymyr Zelensky has said that the hotspots in the war in Luhansk and Donetsk are witnessing heavy fighting, with these regions witnessing one of the bloodiest places on the front line. Following Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, the world's attention turned to the millions of Ukrainians left behind to face the cold. Ongoing Russian missile strikes have destroyed half of the country's power grid, leaving at least 9 million Ukrainians without electricity to heat their homes. Officials in Ukraine have denied the loss of 600 troops in a mass missile strike on barracks housing Ukrainian soldiers, as claimed by Russia yesterday. The strikes on Kramatorsk did not inflict any losses on the Ukrainian armed forces and only targeted civilian infrastructure, said Serhiy Cherevatiy, spokesperson for Ukraine's armed forces in the east. Russia's defense ministry has alleged that missiles had hit two makeshift bases housing 1,300 Ukrainian soldiers in the city of Kramatorsk. Russia is holding back on using its most advanced fighter jets over Ukrainian airspace because it's scared they'll get shot down, the UK's defense ministry said on Monday. In its latest intelligence update, the defense ministry said Moscow had almost certainly used Su-57 Felon fighter jets to conduct missions against Ukraine since at least June. For an aircraft to be considered fifth generation, it must possess specific technical characteristics such as the ability to fly at supersonic speeds without afterburners. The defense ministry cited a satellite image taken on December 25 indicating that 5 of the jets were housed at the only known Felon air base in Russia, in the southern region of Akhtubinsk. Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, said in August that the Felon had already been used brilliantly in combat since Russia's invasion, though there was little evidence at the time that this was the case. Russia's wary tactic is indicative of its continued risk-averse approach to employing its air force in the war against Ukraine, given the risk of significant losses. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine said in an update on Monday that Russia had lost more than 280 airplanes since the beginning of its full-scale invasion of Ukraine.